Hello everyone. Now let's talk about the multi-branch if statement. So previously we have covered the single if and if and else statements. We stated that single if statement is one-way conditional statement, which means if you need to use a conditional statement to create one condition for one possible output, then you could use the single if. And if you need to use the conditional statements for two conditions, to create the conditions for the two possible outputs, then you could use the if and else statement. But what if I need to create multiple conditions for multiple possible outputs? So if an else statement is known as double selection or two-way conditional statements, and single if is one-way conditional statements. But what if I need more than two conditions that needs to be created for more than two possible outputs? Then I can use the multi-branch if. The multi-branch if, it allows us to create else if clause, okay? It allows us to perform different action based on the multiple conditions. Whenever you need to make decision among several alternatives, if the alternatives are like more than two, if you need to create like at least three or more than three conditions, then you could use this multi-branch if, okay? We can use as many else if clause as we want, okay? So depending on how many conditions that you create, you will give the else if clause. So else if conditions can be given between the if and else blocks. Your multi-branch if, it starts with the if block and it ends with the else block. And between those two blocks, you can give as many else if block as you want. So which means if I need to create conditions for 5 possible outputs, I could use one if block, one else block, and 3 else if blocks. And I need to keep the same exact order as well. So even though here I have 5 blocks in total in this multi-branch if, but only one of them gets executed. Okay, only one block gets executed at the end. It will be depending on which block came first that has the true condition. So if the first block's condition is true, then the remaining block's condition will not be checked. Only the first block gets executed. And in order for second block to be executed, the first block condition must be false. And then if the second block's condition is true, then the second block gets executed and remaining blocks gets terminated. And it will be the rule will be the same for the remaining blocks. And this else block, it gets executed only if all the previous conditions are false. So by using multi-branch if, I will be able to make selection among several alternatives. Okay, if I need to create conditions for several alternatives and only one of them needs to be selected at the end, then I could use this multi-branch if. Okay, and here's the syntax of the multi-branch if. You will always start it with the if block. When the if condition is true, the body of the if block gets executed. And if you need to give your second condition, you will use else if block. Right after this if block, you give the else if block. Else if block also has a condition that you will specify. And this condition will only be checked if the previous block's condition is false. And after this else if block, if there's only one more condition left for you to give, if there's only one more possible output that's left that you need to address by creating conditions, then you could use the else block. Remember, else block is the last block in the multi-branch if. After the else block, you cannot give any other blocks. And in the else block, you will not have any other conditions. And if I needed to create more than 3 conditions for more than 3 possible outputs, I could give multiple else if blocks before I give this else block. Now let's take a look at this task. In this task, we need to write a program that can check if the given number is positive or negative or 0. So which means you need to have one of those 3 outputs on the console, either positive or negative or 0. So if I use the single if statement, I would need to create 3 single if statements. And each of those if conditions will be checked one by one. Even if the first single if conditions are already true, it would still need to check the remaining single if conditions. So the best way here is to use the multi-branch if. So that I will have 3 blocks in the multi-branch if, but if the first block's condition is true, the remaining block's condition will not even be checked. Can I use the if and else statement to complete this task? The if and else statement, you will only use it if you need to create conditions for 2 possible outputs, right? If you need to create conditions for 2 scenarios. But here we have 3 scenarios. As long as the number of scenarios are more than 2 that you need to create conditions for, then please use multi-branch if. Okay? So please create a new class for this task. Let's create a new class and name this new class number. Okay. And here's our main method. And a number will be given to you. Here's the number. Suppose that this number, for example, is 100 right now. And then I need to determine whether this number is positive or negative or 0. So there are 3 possible outputs, 3 scenarios that I need to create conditions for in total. So if there were just 2 scenarios that I need to create conditions for, I could use if and else. And if I use single if, I would need to give 3 independent single if to create conditions for those 3 possible outputs. Such as if the number is greater than 0, then the output is going to be positive. Okay, here's my first single if statement. This is the conditional statement that I created for the first condition, which is for the possible output of positive. And then I still need to create the remaining conditions for the remaining possible outputs that I have left. We still have 2 more. So I could use another single if statement to create conditions for if the number is less than 0. If the number is less than 0, the output should be negative number. Okay. Okay, so there are 2 single if statements that I give so far, and I still have to create one more condition for the last condition. So if I continue to use another single if statement, here's my if block. If number is equal to 0, okay, then we can display 0 on the console. So if I run this program now, you see, only one of them got executed, right? It printed positive. But the problem here is if you use 3 single if statements, this is what happens. If the first condition is already true, that means that this should be our final output, right? The number should be positive. So if this condition is true, the output is positive. Does that mean that the compiler will not check the remaining conditions since the first one is already true? Since we are using 3 independent single if statements, every single if statement's conditions will be checked one by one regardless of what. Okay? As long as the program is running, okay, each of those single if statements condition will be checked one by one. Even though we already know that this first if condition is already true, the number is positive and it's not going to be negative or 0, but compiler still needs to check the second if condition and the third if condition. Which means even though this 3 single if statements still give you the expected result, it's not the efficient way of using these single if statements if you need to make decisions among these several alternatives. So the better way would be by using the multi-branch if. I'm going to comment out the single if statement solution that we gave here. And then let me give you the multi-branch if solution. So if I need to use the efficient way to create those 3 conditions for the 3 possible outputs, I should be using multi-branch if. So I will start with the if block first. Here's my if block. If the number is greater than 0, then the output should be positive. Okay. Else if, so this is my first condition that I created. And then as for the second condition, I will use the else if block for the second possible output. And then give my second condition if the number is less than 0. If the number is less than 0, the output should be negative. Okay. So here are the two conditions that I have created so far for in this multi-branch if. And I have one more condition left. As for the last condition in the multi-branch if, we can just use the else block. Because else block gets executed at the very end if all the previous conditions are false. When this else block gets executed, that means the number is 0. So now if I run this program, since my number is 100, it printed this positive on the console. Okay? So the benefit of using multi-branch if here is, if the first condition is true, compiler does not need to check the else if and else those conditions. Remaining blocks will be terminated immediately. Only the first block will get executed afterwards. Okay? And of course, if there were more than three conditions that I have to create, I could continue to give else if blocks before this else block. As many else if block as you can give, and how many else block will be needed will be depending on the total number of the conditions that needs to be created in this conditional statement. See, here we just used one multi-branch if to complete this task. Earlier we used 3 single if statements. Using one if statement is better than 3 if statements. We just used one multi-branch if instead of 3 single if statements. Okay? And at the end, only one block gets executed. Which one gets executed will be depending on whichever block's condition was true first. So for example, if this given number was negative 100, now what happens is that first condition is evaluated to false. If the first condition is false, then the compiler will check the second condition. And if the second condition is true, it executes the second block and third block will be skipped afterwards. So now if I run the program, you see, I got negative on the console. And if this number was 0, that means the first and second conditions will be evaluated to false. If first and second conditions are false, the next condition that we have is the else condition, right? Else block. So when I run the program, the else block gets executed automatically because all the previous conditions were false. Okay, so this is the multi-branch if. And when you use when the student use the multi-branch if, here are some common mistakes that the student make. Forgetting the necessary curly braces. That's the very first common mistake that student makes. Okay? And ending an if statement in the wrong place. That's also a common mistake. So you have to pay attention to every single indentation, okay? Every single indentation, every single curly braces that you are giving for each of the block of the multi-branch if. And it is strongly recommended to use the formatting function of the IntelliJ as well, in order to make sure that those else blocks, else if blocks, and if blocks are placed at right place, and to make sure that no indentations are missing in order to make your codes more readable. Okay, if you write the codes like this, the missing indentations, missing the curly braces, it becomes harder to read your code. Make sure that you will always use the shortcut of the IntelliJ to reformat your codes. That way, your code looks much more clean and much more efficient afterwards. And since this is not the best solution, I'm going to cut it off from here and paste it outside the class. Okay? But make sure that why this single if solution here is not the efficient way, or we don't need it, you can also delete this one. So whenever you have to create conditional statements for 3 or more than 3 scenarios, then you could use the multi-branch if. Now let's do the short summary of single if versus if and else versus the multi-branch if. So the single if statement, it is known as one-way conditional statement. You could also give multiple single if statements back to back, okay? But 0 or any combination of them can be executed. So if your goal is only one of them to be executed, then it's not recommended to use multiple single if statements. Because when you have multiple single if statements, every single if condition will be checked one by one. As soon as it's true, then its block gets executed. Meaning that multiple single if blocks could be executed if their conditions are true. So if you have to select one out of multiples, then please do not use this single if. In the if and else block, one of the two statements is executed. It's known as the two-way conditional statements. Only one of them will be selected. Which one will be selected will be depending on the if condition. If the condition is true, the first block gets executed. Otherwise, the else block, the second block gets executed. Okay, and this if and else block, you will only use it if you have to create conditions for two scenarios, two possible scenarios only. Not more, not less than two. And of course, if you have to create the conditions for more than two scenarios, if there are more than two possible outputs and only one of them needs to be selected, then we could use the multi-branch if. And when you use the multi-branch if, only one block gets executed. Regardless of how many blocks that you have in the multi-branch if, only one of them gets executed. And remember, when you use the multi-branch if, you can only give one if, one else, but you can give as many else if as you want. And the order must be always the same. If block needs to be placed first, then your else if blocks, and lastly, the else block. Thank you so much, everyone. See you all in the next video.